Harold Winslow sat in silence as the microwave hummed behind him, casting a dim orange glow over his otherwise dark kitchen. The stew inside was something canned, something cheap, something he no longer tasted. He didn't even hear the beep when it was done. His hearing had dulled over the years, like everything else. Across the table sat the same prescription bottle that had been there for 2 weeks now, the label faded, the cap childproof though there were no children around. There hadn't been for a long time. The TV buzzed quietly in the living room, some news channel cycling through the day's events, markets, politics, another rocket launch. He wasn't really watching, not until the screen lit up with the gleam of white flame rising into the sky, a voice narrating the historic moment. SpaceX's latest shuttle had just breached the atmosphere. A flash of Elon Musk, eyes forward, jaw set like stone, the very picture of determined vision. Then the words came, not from a reporter, not from a press release, but from the man himself. "You're never too old to reinvent," Musk said, almost like he was sitting in Harold's kitchen, speaking through the static and microwave haze, reaching straight into the place Harold had buried a long time ago. Something shifted. Just slightly. Not a lightning bolt, more like a flicker of something Harold couldn't name yet, annoyance maybe, at the audacity of that sentence, or longing, maybe, for the version of himself that once would have believed it. He turned away, telling himself it didn't matter. Not to him. That was for young people. For billionaires. For dreamers. Not for a 68-year-old man with arthritis in his knuckles and a garage full of junk that used to mean something. The stew went cold again. He didn't notice. He stared at the bottle on the table, then at the dusty window across from him, where the reflection of a man he barely recognized stared back. Deep lines carved beneath his eyes, skin thinner than he remembered. That face didn't belong to an engineer. It belonged to someone who had stopped trying. Who had settled into invisibility. Who waited now, not for purpose, but for permission to fade. A knock at the door snapped him out of it. It was the neighbor kid, dropping off his mail. They called him Mr. W now, like some kind of mascot, a fixture of the block, harmless and forgotten. The kid smiled politely, handed over the bundle, and ran off. Junk mail. Bills. A brochure for a funeral plan he didn't remember signing up for. As he set it aside, his hand brushed against something else, a torn corner of a yellowing photo, poking out from beneath the table's plastic cover. He pulled it free. A younger man, hair thick and dark, standing beside a workbench with a half-built drone prototype and a proud smile that hadn't existed in years. His late wife, Claire, had taken that photo. Harold Winslow, the man who thinks he can fly without wings, she'd teased, laughing at how he talked to his machines like they were children. That was the year he almost patented his design. That was the year it all could have changed. But then the company folded. The funding dried up. Life happened. Claire got sick. The drone never flew. That Harold had disappeared. Until tonight. He felt something press behind his ribs, not quite pain, not quite sorrow, more like grief's echo. Like something once sharp had been dulled by decades of disuse. He held the photo for a long time, then set it beside the stew and looked back toward the living room. The TV now showed a clip from an old Musk interview. "Some people wait for permission," Musk was saying. "Some people wait until the timing feels perfect. The truth is, there's never a right time. You build while everything's on fire. That's how you survive." Harold didn't know why, but he stood. He walked, not quickly, but with purpose he hadn't felt in years, down the hallway, past the bedroom where Claire's perfume still lived in the carpet, down to the locked garage door. The key stuck. Of course it did. Everything in this house stuck now. But it turned eventually. The garage door groaned open, like a throat clearing after decades of silence. Darkness. Dust. Cobwebs thick as gauze. He flipped the light switch and half the bulbs flickered. There it was, the workbench. The scattered tools. The metal casing of the drone that never flew, still there like a monument to what almost was. He didn't walk in. Not yet. Just stood there, the cold concrete under his feet, the smell of rust and oil so familiar it hurt. For a moment, he could hear Claire's voice behind him, soft, amused, full of love. "You still talking to that flying tin can, Harold?" He laughed once, just a breath. He stepped inside. Slowly, carefully, running his fingers along the old machine. The shell was intact. The wings, thin carbon, were cracked at the edges. The battery was long dead. But something about it felt alive again, like it had been waiting for him. Like it knew this wasn't over. A spider skittered across the surface and vanished. He didn't flinch. The silence was sacred now. Like he was standing inside a church built for memory. He reached beneath the bench and pulled out the old journal, his idea book, still intact. He flipped it open. Page after page of sketches, equations, scribbles, what-ifs. One corner was stained with coffee, another wrinkled with Claire's handwriting in the margin, "Make it beautiful, Harold." His eyes stung. He blinked it away. Then he said it out loud, as if the drone, the garage, the quiet house were all listening, "Maybe it's not too late." The words sounded strange in his mouth, too big for the room, too bold. But they were true. Not a declaration. A question. An invitation. Back in the kitchen, the TV had moved on. Stocks. Crime. The world marched forward. But Harold didn't. Not anymore. That night, he didn't eat the stew. He didn't turn off the garage light. He didn't take the pills. Instead, he stayed up rereading his notes, redrawing the blueprints, imagining new designs. He wrote on the last page of the journal in big, shaky letters, "Build one more." As dawn crept over the horizon, light spilling into the corners of the house that had been dark for years, Harold Winslow sat in the garage with grease on his hands and something close to hope growing in his chest. He wasn't sure where this would go. He didn't know if anyone would care. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel forgotten. He felt unfinished. The voice of Elon Musk echoed in his mind, not as a celebrity or a genius or some unreachable figure, but as a reminder. You're never too old to reinvent. What if that was true? What if the end wasn't really the end, but a doorway back to purpose? What if everything he believed about getting old was wrong? Maybe that night wasn't about rockets or drones or fame. Maybe it was about ignition. The moment when something long dormant flickers back to life. The moment when a man staring at cold stew and broken dreams decides, quietly and without fanfare, that he's not done yet. That was the moment it all changed. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Morning arrived without ceremony. No birds chirping, no golden sunbeams spilling across a smiling face, just the slow stretch of gray light pressing against the curtains, revealing the old house in the quiet honesty of day. Harold Winslow stood in the bathroom, shirtless, staring at the man in the mirror. The light was unkind. It showed every fold, every sag, every vein pushing up beneath translucent skin. His chest had sunken, arms soft, a roadmap of aging carved into muscle that once lifted engine blocks and grandchildren. The man in the glass wasn't how he remembered himself. That man was taller. Sharper. He wore pressed shirts and smelled like motor oil and aftershave. This one, this ghost, smelled faintly of arthritis cream and silence. He leaned closer. The eyes were the same, though. Hazel, a little bloodshot. The same eyes that had once stared through safety goggles into the guts of machines, dreaming of how to make them soar. But behind them now was something else. Not fear exactly. Not shame. Just distance. Like he was still trying to catch up with the life that had kept walking without him. He sighed and turned the faucet on, the water cold and biting. He splashed his face, patted it dry with a towel that had once been part of a set Claire picked out. The matching one had frayed years ago, and he hadn't had the heart to throw it out. He looked down. His toothbrush sat next to hers, still in the cup, untouched, like it was waiting for her return. He hadn't removed it. Couldn't. Her absence had weight. It sat on the house like dust. Thick and unmoving. The bedroom was still half hers. Her closet, untouched. Her perfume, a bottle with only a few spritzes left, still stood on the dresser. Every now and then, Harold would uncap it and take one deep breath, just to feel her near. But it always left him more hollow. He dressed slowly. Elastic waist pants, polo shirt, the same sneakers he wore for yard work. He didn't plan to go anywhere, but dressing gave the day shape. It made him feel like he hadn't completely disappeared. He stepped into the hallway and paused by the photo frames lining the wall. Family pictures. Christmas in '89. A beach trip when Mike was 5. Claire in a wide-brimmed hat, laughing, holding a seashell to her ear. He pressed his fingers lightly against the glass, then moved on. In the kitchen, the light was different, stronger, almost too bright. It made the clutter harder to ignore. Dishes in the sink. A junk drawer that wouldn't close. A sticky note stuck to the fridge from 3 years ago that read, "You promised you'd eat better." Claire. He hadn't removed that either. He poured a cup of coffee, the bitter kind that stained mugs and needed sugar to be tolerable. He didn't bother with sugar. He took it to the garage. The drone sat on the workbench, still as a tombstone, waiting. His journal lay beside it, open to the page he'd written last night. Build one more. The pen was there too, uncapped. It looked like he'd written a vow. He ran a hand across the notebook, then picked up the drone gently, like it might fall apart in his hands. It didn't. The frame was sturdy. The wings, though cracked, were fixable. He sat on the old stool, which creaked beneath his weight, and stared at the machine. In the quiet, his thoughts wandered back, not to last night, but to before. To the years when he believed things could still happen. When he still had time. He remembered the first time he drew the design. It was 1993. He had just read an article about military surveillance aircraft, and something had clicked. Why not build something smaller, smarter? Something that could fly autonomously, gather data, maybe even deliver payloads. Not for war, but for rescue missions. Emergency medicine. Help in places where people couldn't reach in time. He poured himself into the idea, staying up late sketching, building prototypes out of foam and lightweight wood. Claire supported him. Not with money, God knew they barely had enough back then, but with faith. She believed in his mind, his hands, his stubbornness. Even when no one else did. He entered a local inventors contest. Drove 2 towns over with the prototype in the back seat, praying it would survive the potholes. It didn't win, but a guy from a startup saw it and offered him a meeting. It felt like a dream cracking open into daylight. Then Claire got sick. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just the slow kind of sick that wears away at a person inch by inch. Doctor visits. Medications. Then more. The startup meeting got delayed. Then delayed again. The prototype stayed in the garage while Harold stayed by her side. She needed him. So he stopped drawing. Stopped building. Told himself it didn't matter. That he had time. But time had a way of slipping through fingers. One day, she was gone. And he was left with this house, this project he'd buried, and a son who had grown into a man Harold barely recognized. Mike. Now there was a name that weighed heavy. They used to be close. When Mike was a boy, he'd sit in the garage for hours, watching Harold build things, birdhouses, bottle rockets, the first crude versions of the drone. He'd hand his dad tools like a nurse to a surgeon. "You're gonna be famous one day," Mike used to say. "I'm gonna tell people my dad made stuff that flies." But after Claire died, something broke between them. Maybe it was Harold's silence. Maybe it was Mike's anger at how everything fell apart. They both retreated. Phone calls grew short. Then rare. Now they barely spoke. And when they did, it was stiff, polite, hollow. Last Christmas, Mike had called to say he couldn't make it, something about work and flights being expensive. Harold had nodded into the phone, even though Mike couldn't see him. "Of course," he'd said. "Next year, then." But he hadn't believed it. He picked up a wrench now, ran his fingers over the smooth steel. It felt good. Solid. He turned back to the drone and began inspecting the joints. A few screws were missing. The battery pack needed replacing. The controller was probably fried. But it wasn't dead. Not yet. Neither was he. He worked for an hour, just tinkering, not really fixing anything yet, just learning the feel of it again. Remembering. Letting his mind move in ways it hadn't for years. When he finally stood, his knees popped. His back ached. But his hands felt alive. That night, he sat on the back porch with a beer he didn't particularly like, watching the sky fade from blue to orange to purple. A neighbor's dog barked in the distance. Somewhere across the block, wind chimes played a crooked tune. He looked up. The stars were faint, but present. As if waiting. Claire used to tell him he stared at the sky too much. "You've got 2 feet on the ground," she'd say. "Maybe try living there for a while." He smiled. "Maybe now's the time to fly, Claire," he whispered. "Maybe now's all I've got." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his old flip phone. It was scratched and slow and barely held a charge. He opened the messaging app and hovered over Mike's name. Then closed it. Not yet. He wasn't ready. Instead, he opened the web browser and typed one word, drones. Articles, forums, videos poured in. New designs, old schematics, build tutorials. The world had moved on from him. But not so far that he couldn't catch up. One article caught his eye, about a 15-year-old kid from Ohio who built a functioning drone from junkyard parts and started a tech club in his garage. He clicked on the video. The kid was sharp, excited, full of fire. Reminded Harold of someone. At the end of the clip, the kid looked straight at the camera and said, "Doesn't matter how old you are. You can build anything. Just start." Harold stared at the screen. Then he opened a new tab. How to upload a video to YouTube. He didn't know what he was doing. But he knew why he was doing it. Not for fame. Not for redemption. Just, to see what was still possible. And maybe, just maybe, to prove to himself that the man in the mirror wasn't a ghost after all. It was Tuesday when Harold truly felt the weight of being invisible. Not in a grand, cinematic way, no dramatic gestures or gasps or sudden rejections, just the slow, quiet erosion of being seen. It began with the doctor's office, a quarterly checkup, the kind he used to breeze through without concern. Now it felt more like a performance review. He sat on the crinkled white paper in exam room 3 while fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Dr. Simmons, a man half his age with the bedside manner of a voicemail, clicked through Harold's chart on a tablet and occasionally looked up with an expression that hovered somewhere between fatigue and condescension. "You've gained 4 pounds since last quarter," he said, not accusatory, just factual. "Your blood pressure's a little high. Cholesterol too." Harold nodded, like he was in school again, receiving marks for a test he hadn't studied for. "You getting enough movement these days?" the doctor asked. Harold hesitated. "I've been working in the garage again," he offered. Dr. Simmons raised an eyebrow, interested but unconvinced. Working on what? An old project, Harold replied. A drone. Used to be my design, back in the 90s. Figured I'd dust it off, see if it still had wings. The doctor smirked slightly, as if Harold had told a cute story about a hobby that would pass in a week. Well, don't overdo it. At your age, pushing too hard can cause more harm than good. You don't need to be an engineer. Just focus on staying upright. He said it like he was helping. Like Harold should be grateful for the warning. Instead, Harold felt something sting. Not anger. Not even offense. Just a quiet insult tucked inside concern. He left the office with a folded printout of diet tips and a fresh refill for his blood pressure meds. Outside, the sun was too bright, and the walk to the car felt longer than it should have. His joints ached in their usual rhythm. He moved slowly, but not because he had to. Because he knew no one was waiting. The world wasn't rushing for him anymore. He stopped by the diner on Main Street, mostly out of habit. It was the kind of place where time didn't move much. Booths worn from decades of elbows and coffee rings, ceiling fans that spun lazily overhead, a jukebox in the corner that hadn't worked since the Bush administration. He sat in his usual booth by the window, ordered the special, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, peas, and tried to read the paper, though his eyes kept drifting to the window, where a younger couple was laughing over iced coffees outside. They were maybe in their 30s. The woman kept brushing crumbs from the man's shirt and laughing like it was the most intimate thing in the world. Harold couldn't remember the last time someone touched his shirt. The waitress, Tina, maybe, refilled his coffee without asking. "Here you go, sweetie," she said with a smile, already turning away before he could say thank you. He hated that word. Not because it was rude, but because it reminded him of how people treat the elderly when they don't really see them, just a collection of gray hair, soft sweaters, and stories no one has time to hear. He paid in cash and left a decent tip, then walked back to his car, the old Ford creaking in protest as he sank into the seat. The ride home was quiet, no radio. Just the sound of wind and tires and thoughts he couldn't quite stop. When he pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same, faded brick, paint peeling around the windows, a lawn he hadn't mowed in a week. He used to keep it pristine, like a badge of honor. Now it felt like a mirror for how much had slipped. He didn't go inside right away. Instead, he walked around to the garage and opened it slowly, like approaching an old friend you hadn't called in years. The drone was still on the bench, untouched since yesterday. He sat in the stool and picked it up again, feeling the weight of it, the promise of what it once meant. He opened his journal and flipped to the sketches, running his fingers over the graphite lines like they might still come to life. Then he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He picked up his phone and turned on the front-facing camera. The reflection was worse than the mirror, washed out, distorted by bad lighting and bad angles. But he didn't look away. He hit record. "This is Harold Winslow," he said, his voice unsure at first. "I'm 68 years old. I used to build things. Drones, mostly. Machines that could fly. I stopped for a long time. Life got in the way. But I'm starting again. Maybe just one. Maybe more. I don't know. I just want to see if the part of me that used to believe in possibilities is still in there." He paused. "If you're watching this, maybe you've got something you left behind too. A project. A song. A story. Maybe it's not too late. Maybe we're not too old. Maybe we've just been waiting for someone to say it's okay to try again." He ended the video and stared at the screen for a long time. Then, slowly, he figured out how to upload it to YouTube. He didn't title it anything clever. Just, "Trying Again, Day 1. That night, he had soup from a can and didn't bother heating it. He sat in his recliner, remote in hand, flipping through the channels without watching anything. Noise was just a way to keep the loneliness from getting too loud. When the phone buzzed, he nearly dropped it. A notification. YouTube. One comment. His heart beat faster than it had in weeks. He opened it. The comment was simple. Good luck, Harold. I'll be watching. A stranger. A single voice in the void. But it landed like thunder. Someone saw him. That night, he slept with the journal on his nightstand. In the morning, he checked the video again. 27 views. 5 comments. One said, "My dad's your age and he won't even leave the couch. This is inspiring." Another, "You've already built more than most." He read them all twice, then 3 times. He wrote a reply to each one. Not because he thought it mattered to them, but because it mattered to him. He started filming more. Not every day, but often. Small updates. Him tweaking the design. Talking about problems with the battery. Asking if anyone knew where to find old controller boards. He didn't expect answers. But they came. Slowly, the comments turned into conversations. People offered ideas. Links. Encouragement. And questions. Where have you been, Harold? Why did you stop? What else did you build? And those questions made him remember. Made him feel the weight of everything he hadn't finished. Everything he thought had expired. Including himself. On Thursday, he called Mike. It went to voicemail. He hung up. On Friday, he called again. Still voicemail. This time he left a message. "Hey, Mike. It's Dad. I started working on that old drone again. The one you helped me name. Remember? Firefly. Anyway, if you get a chance, maybe call me back. I'd love to talk. Just talk. That's all." He hung up, knowing the odds. But he felt lighter. He'd sent the signal. The radar was on. And then, on Saturday morning, while sipping coffee that was somehow both too hot and too bitter, he opened YouTube again. 63 views. 11 comments. 1 new subscriber. A name popped up, JTechKid92. The profile picture was a cartoon robot. The comment read, "Hey Harold, I've got parts. I'm building my own drone too. Want to collaborate?" Harold blinked. A teen, probably. Some kid in a basement. But it didn't matter. They'd seen him. They'd responded. For the first time in years, he wasn't talking to the walls. The silence had cracked. On a random Tuesday, in a diner where no one looked twice, in a doctor's office where he was a set of numbers, he had felt invisible. But now, sitting in his garage, camera lens smudged, hair uncombed, hands slightly trembling, he was starting to be seen again. Not for what he'd lost. But for what he still held. The Tuesday that began with silence had ended with signal. Weak, maybe. But real. And that was enough. The garage door hadn't worked properly in years. It groaned like a tired old man every time Harold forced it up, the springs squealing, the panels jerking along the tracks. But it still moved. And that was something. This morning, he opened it wider than usual. The breeze that came in was cool and dry, carrying the scent of cut grass and someone's charcoal grill already warming for lunch. He stood in the opening, a silhouette against the light, blinking into the morning sun like he wasn't sure if the world was real. For weeks, maybe longer, he'd only cracked the door open enough to slip through. He didn't want the neighbors seeing inside, didn't want anyone asking questions about the mess, the rust, the man inside trying to build something out of time. But today, he wanted the air. The light. Maybe even the risk of being seen. The drone, his drone, sat in the center of the bench now, surrounded by notes, wires, half-disassembled controllers, old soldering irons and new receipts from online parts orders. He was further along than he'd expected. The frame was fully repaired. The motor was mounted. The wings were reinforced with carbon tape and sanded smooth. All it lacked now was power. Control. Flight. He stared at it the way he used to look at Claire when she was reading, like he didn't want to speak and ruin the moment. Then he got to work. He started with the controller board. It was too old to be compatible with any of the new software, and he knew just enough about code to know how far behind he was. That's where the kid came in. JTech Kid 92. Turned out his real name was Jamie. 14 years old. Lived outside of Cincinnati. Harold had sent him a message the day after his comment, not expecting much, maybe a few links or a suggestion. What he got was a full PDF with annotated diagrams, firmware notes, even a list of online suppliers for newer, cheaper batteries. "I watch all your videos," Jamie wrote in one message. "My grandpa used to build stuff too, but he stopped. Watching you makes me want to keep going." Harold didn't know how to respond to that at first. The words hit harder than he expected. He sat with them for a while before typing back. "Thanks, Jamie. I don't know what I'm doing half the time, but it feels good to do it anyway. You remind me of my son when he was younger. He used to believe in me." Jamie replied 2 minutes later. "I believe in you too." The message made Harold cry. Not loud sobs. Just silent tears that slipped down his cheeks as he sat there in the glow of the laptop screen, hands still dusty from sanding the wing. No one had said that to him in years. Maybe decades. Now, in the garage, he worked with new energy. Not just the muscle memory of an old engineer, but the fuel of being needed. Even if just by one curious kid in Ohio. By noon, the soldering iron was hot, and his hands were trembling. Not from age, though that was part of it, but from nerves. The connections had to be perfect. Any mistake could fry the board. He steadied himself, breathing slowly, counting like Claire used to when she was nervous. 1, 2, 3, go. He connected the wire. The solder sizzled and cooled. He smiled. The first clean contact in years. Outside, a car passed by slowly. He didn't look up. Let them see. Let them wonder. Maybe someone would ask what he was building. Maybe someone would care. Or maybe not. But that wasn't the point anymore. The point was that he was building. Around 3 p.m., he heard footsteps on the gravel outside the garage. He stiffened, wiped his hands on a rag. Then a voice, light, female, uncertain. "Mr. Winslow?" He turned. It was Lucy Morales, the girl from 2 houses down. Not a girl, really, probably 35 or 40 now. She used to ride her bike past his driveway when she was little, waving as Claire shouted, "Be careful, sweetheart." Harold smiled cautiously. "Lucy," he said. "Didn't recognize you for a second." She stepped closer, careful not to intrude. "I was just walking the dog and, well, I saw the garage open. I don't think I've seen it open in years." He chuckled. "It's been a while." She glanced past him at the drone. "Are you working on something?" "Trying to get an old dream off the ground," he said. Her eyes lit up with curiosity. "It looks amazing. Is it a drone?" "It will be," he nodded. "Eventually. If I don't mess it up." She smiled. "If you ever need anything, tools, help, or just coffee, I'm usually home during the week." Harold nodded, surprised by how grateful he felt. "Thank you, Lucy. That means more than you know." She waved and kept walking. The dog barked once and sniffed the air. Harold watched them disappear down the block, the echo of her offer still warm in his chest. Inside the garage, the drone gleamed softly under the hanging light. He turned back to it and got back to work. By evening, he had finished installing the new power unit. Jamie had walked him through the wiring over text, sending diagrams and photos of his own builds. Harold was learning fast. Learning again. He hadn't felt this alive in years. He filmed a short video, just a minute long, explaining the power supply upgrade, thanking Jamie publicly. At the end, he added something unscripted. When you get older, people stop expecting things from you. Sometimes you start expecting less of yourself, too. But building this, even just trying again, it feels like a part of me woke up. So if you've got something you left behind, maybe it's time to open that door. Just a crack. See what light comes in. He posted the video. An hour later, it had 300 views. More than he'd ever had before. He got 3 new subscribers and 17 comments. One of them read, "I'm 72. I haven't touched a paintbrush in 10 years. I'm opening my studio tomorrow. Thank you, Harold." Another, "My dad died last year. He would have loved your videos. Thanks for making me feel close to him again." The messages kept coming. Like water seeping through cracks, reviving the dry ground he'd thought was long dead. That night, he sat on the porch again, notebook in hand, stars overhead. He wrote down new ideas. New designs. New versions of the drone. He sketched until his hand cramped. And then he picked up the phone. He didn't expect Mike to answer. He just wanted to leave another message. But this time, it rang twice, and then, click. "Dad?" Harold froze. His mouth went dry. "Mike," he managed. "I didn't think you'd pick up." A pause. Then, softer, "I saw your videos." Harold's heart skipped. "You did?" "Yeah. Someone sent me a link. Said, 'This guy reminds me of you.' Then I clicked and there you were." Silence again. Then Mike said, "Why didn't you tell me?" Harold swallowed hard. "I didn't think you'd care." "We haven't really talked," Mike interrupted, voice tight. "I would have cared. I still do." The words hung there, raw and heavy. Harold blinked hard. "I didn't know how to reach out." "This was a good way," Mike said. "You look alive in those videos. Like yourself again." "I feel like myself again," Harold said quietly. "It's not about the drone, really. It's about remembering I'm not done." Mike's voice cracked. "I'd like to come see it sometime. If that's okay." Harold closed his eyes. "Yeah, Mike. That's more than okay." They talked for 5 more minutes. Not long. Not deep. But it was enough. The next morning, Harold opened the garage door again. This time, it didn't feel like an act of courage. It felt normal. Like breathing. Like waking up. The drone sat waiting. The project continued. But more importantly, the world had come in, just a little. The door had creaked open. And light, real, undeniable light, was spilling through. The hum of Harold's old garage had changed. Where once it had sounded like stillness and disuse, it now carried the rhythm of something stirring. Clicks of a soldering iron, the scratch of pencil across schematics, the whir of a laptop fan running a little too hot, and beneath it all, the faint sound of hope returning to a place it had long abandoned. The drone sat on the bench, no longer a broken relic from a dusty past but a living thing, close to waking. The wings were fitted and tested. The power source had passed every check. The controller board, thanks to Jamie's guidance, now responded to Harold's touch like an old friend recognizing its master. But it wasn't just about the mechanics anymore. Harold had started recording every part of the process, timidly at first, just holding up a part and explaining what it did. Then with more confidence, showing wiring tricks, talking through problems and solutions, admitting when he got it wrong. His voice was shaky some days and clear others, but the authenticity cut through. People started watching. A few hundred turned to a few thousand. Comments filled up like a chalkboard in a one-room schoolhouse. Names from all over. Some young, asking technical questions. Some older, writing things like, "I didn't think people our age could still learn like this," and, "You reminded me of the garage my husband used to work in." One woman, Meredith from Oregon, wrote, "I've been watching with my morning coffee. You make me feel like I'm not invisible." That comment lingered with Harold all day. Not just because of what she said, but because it sounded like something he would have said himself only a month ago. Invisible. Forgotten. Until he began talking to a lens, showing the world what he could still build. He never set out to inspire anyone. He just wanted to feel real again. But now, every nut and bolt carried more weight, as if each piece wasn't just part of the machine, but part of the message. That afternoon, he tested the propellers. The drone was still grounded, but the blades spun to life with a light hum that buzzed up through the bench and into his fingertips. He grinned, surprised by how much joy surged through him. It worked. It was real. It was almost time to fly. He set the controller down and opened his notebook. For a moment, he just looked at the blank page, then began to write. Not a blueprint. Not a checklist. But something else. A script. Today, I realize the drone isn't the thing I'm really building. I'm building the courage to try again. Every wire I connect, every comment I read, it reminds me I'm not gone. Not yet. There's still fuel in the tank. Still wind in the wings. If you're watching this, and you've got something buried under the years, something you thought was too late to return to, please hear me. It's not too late. You're not too late. I thought I was done. But I was just paused. He didn't cry writing it, but he felt close. It was the kind of message he wished someone had sent him during those long days after Claire passed, when the house felt like a mausoleum and the garage like a grave. He recorded it in one take. No cuts. Just his weathered face in the glow of the garage light, voice low and steady, eyes clear. When he uploaded the video, he titled it simply, "The Real Reason I'm Building This." It was only 4 minutes long. By morning, it had over 20,000 views. It wasn't viral in the way cat videos or celebrity stumbles go viral, but it touched a nerve. A quiet one. A deep one. And people responded. This made me call my father for the first time in years. I'm 67. I bought a guitar today. Thank you. Just, thank you. The messages rolled in faster than he could reply to them. Jamie messaged too. Mr. Winslow, I showed your video to my robotics class. My teacher cried. You're famous now. Harold chuckled, then messaged back, I'd rather be useful than famous. He looked around the garage, then added, almost flight ready. Want to help with the final code? Jamie's reply came in seconds, heck yes. They spent the next 2 nights refining the flight software, Jamie walking him through line after line on a shared document, explaining logic loops and GPS syncing and emergency return protocols. Harold's eyes blurred a few times, but his mind stayed sharp. It felt like building a bridge, between generations, between past and present, between who he was and who he still might become. By the 3rd day, they had a working flight program. Jamie sent a file named Winslow_v1_final.py. Harold stared at it for a long moment before opening it. It was real. Ready. The drone could fly. He messaged Mike that night. Just a short text. Test flight tomorrow. If you want to come. He didn't expect a reply. But 5 minutes later, his phone buzzed. I'll be there. What time? Harold read it twice, smiling so wide it hurt. The next morning, he packed the drone into an old padded toolbox lined with foam. He dressed with purpose, a clean shirt, brushed hair, even polished his shoes. He hadn't done that since Claire's service. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. Just locked up the house, opened the garage one last time, and walked out with the drone like a man carrying a second chance. The park was quiet when he arrived, just a few dog walkers and some joggers. It was the same place he and Mike used to fly kites when he was little. Big open field. No wires. No trees. Just sky. He picked a spot near the middle and set the drone down carefully. The wind was low. The air was dry. Perfect conditions. He knelt, checking every connection again, fingers steady, mind focused. Behind him, he heard gravel crunch. He turned. Mike. Older than Harold remembered, but then again, so was he. Mike had a trimmed beard, jeans, and a worn leather jacket Harold hadn't seen before. For a second, they just looked at each other. Then Mike smiled. "Looks like Firefly's back." Harold chuckled. "Took her long enough." Mike stepped closer. "Can I help?" Harold nodded and handed him the controller. Their fingers touched for just a moment, nothing dramatic, but enough to bridge the silence of years. Together, they powered the drone. Lights blinked. Motors hummed. Harold glanced at Mike. "You ready?" Mike nodded. "Let's fly." Harold tapped the launch sequence. The propellers spun faster, lifting the machine slowly, steadily, until it hovered 3 feet above the ground. Harold let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It hovered. It held. It was flying. He nudged the joystick gently. The drone moved forward, then arced left, climbed higher. It danced in the air, graceful, weightless, real. A few people nearby stopped and watched. Someone clapped. A dog barked excitedly. But Harold only had eyes for the sky and for the sun standing beside him. "You did it," Mike said, voice soft. Harold shook his head. "We did." When they landed the drone 15 minutes later, Harold felt something lift inside him. Not pride exactly. Something deeper. Release. Like a knot untied. He packed the drone away slowly, carefully, savoring every second. Mike helped. Then they walked to the bench and sat down. Neither spoke for a while. Then Mike asked, "Why now, Dad? After all these years?" Harold looked at the sky. "Because I was tired of feeling like my story was already over." Mike nodded. "It's not." Harold turned to him. "Neither is ours." Mike didn't respond right away. Then he placed a hand on Harold's shoulder. "I'd like to be part of what comes next." Harold closed his eyes, the wind brushing gently across his face, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel old. He felt, beginning. The drone was no longer just a machine to Harold. It had become a kind of mirror, each wire and chip reflecting back parts of himself he thought were gone. After the flight with Mike, the sky felt different. Wider. Less indifferent. They didn't say much that afternoon, just shared a quiet lunch at the diner, the same booth Harold had sat in so many times alone. But now it wasn't loneliness that filled the space across from him, it was the presence of something slowly healing. Mike had asked questions about the build, nodding with genuine curiosity as Harold explained the stabilization algorithms Jamie had helped him write, the battery optimization, the retrofitted wing design. Mike had always had his mother's warmth but Harold's mechanical brain, and somewhere in the rhythms of old habits and new efforts, a reconnection had taken root. They agreed to meet again the following weekend, maybe work on a new model together. "We could build 2, Mike said. "Yours and mine. Fly them together." That night, Harold sat on the porch under a pale blue sky turning amber at the edges. The sun dipped low behind the neighbor's roofline and the wind carried the far-off scent of someone's grill again. He had his notebook in his lap and his laptop beside him. The inbox was full now, emails, YouTube messages, even one from a local high school asking if he'd consider coming in to talk to their robotics class. That one made him laugh out loud. He hadn't spoken in front of a group since the mid-90s when he presented a concept drone at a military tech convention in Baltimore. He'd stood behind a podium shaking so hard his demo nearly shorted out from sweat. But something about the idea didn't scare him anymore. In fact, it stirred something that felt like a challenge. That night he recorded a new video, not about the drone, not about parts or updates. Just him, sitting on the porch, voice calm and clear. A few weeks ago, he said, I wasn't sure I had anything left to build. I thought I was winding down, shrinking back, waiting out the clock. But something changed. I don't know if it was the drone, or the messages, or just finally letting go of the idea that age meant irrelevance. What I do know is this, we all have something left. Something worth sharing. Even if it's just the courage to try again. He paused, looking down at his hands, then back at the lens. So if you're sitting on a dream, if your garage is full of dust and old plans, if your heart still flickers when you hear the sound of something being built, don't wait. Open the door. Let the world in. It's not too late. He ended the video there. No music. No cuts. Just truth. Raw and human and resonant. The next day, it passed 50,000 views. Emails came from veterans. Retired engineers. Widows. Grandparents. One message from a woman named Ruth simply said, I've been knitting scarves for charity for years. Never thought it mattered. You made me realize it does. Jamie messaged again too, sharing a photo of his first solo flight with a tiny red drone hovering proudly over a baseball diamond. Wouldn't have done this without you, Mr. Winslow. Harold printed the photo and taped it above his workbench. He started taping more things there, fan art someone had sent of the Firefly drone, a child's crayon drawing of Mr. Harold's flying robot, a quote from Elon Musk that someone had commented under one of his videos, some people don't like change, but you need to embrace change if the alternative is disaster. That line struck him. He'd resisted change for years. Watched life pass like a freight train he was too tired to catch. But disaster hadn't come as fire or collapse, it came as stillness. As disappearing. As silence. And maybe change, even this late, even at 68, wasn't a threat. Maybe it was a lifeline. A week after the flight, Mike showed up at the garage with a toolbox and a grin. Ready to build mine? He asked. Harold had already cleared space. For the next few weekends, they worked side by side. It wasn't always easy, fingers stiff with age, eyesight not what it used to be, but the rhythm returned. Father and son, soldering and sanding, laughing and arguing over blade pitch and battery weight. At one point, Harold said, we're not just fixing drones. We're fixing time. Mike nodded slowly. Yeah, Dad. I think we are. The videos became more than updates. They became stories. Not just Harold's, but others too. He started inviting guests. Jamie joined via video chat, sharing how he was now tutoring younger kids at school in robotics. Ruth sent in a video of her knitting group wrapping scarves for cancer patients, each one tagged with a note that read, built with love and second chances. The high school visit happened too. Harold stood in front of a class of 15 wide-eyed students, drone in hand, heart pounding. You don't have to be young to start something, he said. But it sure helps to believe like you're young. They applauded him. Asked questions. One kid even asked for a selfie. Harold laughed all the way home. When he got back, he found an envelope in the mailbox. No return address. Inside was a photo. Him and Claire, at a picnic, maybe 30 years ago. Her hair was blowing across her eyes. He had his hand on her shoulder. The back of the photo said, in her handwriting, "We always flew better together." He didn't know where it had come from. Maybe something Mike found and sent. Maybe something left behind in a forgotten drawer. But it gutted him in the most beautiful way. That night, he sat in the garage long after dark, lights low, fingers tracing the curve of the drone's wings. He whispered, "You'd like this, Claire. You'd laugh at how long it took me. But you'd be proud." The wind rustled outside. A soft, ghostly sound that felt like a yes. He began designing a new model that week. Lighter, faster, more responsive. He called it the Phoenix. Jamie helped with the specs. Mike started printing parts with a 3D printer he bought used from a friend. They set a goal, a cross-country flight, broken into segments, launched and tracked by volunteers in every state. Each stop hosted by someone from the community. They put out the call. Within 48 hours, people from 32 states had signed up. A retired Air Force mechanic in Arizona. A mother-daughter team in Vermont. A high school robotics club in Kansas. Harold stood in the center of the garage, a map pinned to the wall behind him covered in little flags. He looked at the camera and said, "We're going to fly across America. Not because we have to. Not because it's easy. But because we can. Because there are still miles left in all of us." The comments exploded. Sponsors started reaching out, small tech companies offering parts, older hobbyists offering backup gear. But Harold turned them down. "This isn't about money," he said in a follow-up video. "It's about momentum. It's about people." The Phoenix was finished in April. Sleek, polished, powerful. Mike took the controls for the test flight while Harold filmed. It soared higher than Firefly ever had, cutting through clouds like it belonged there. They watched in silence, both men blinking back something they wouldn't call tears. Later, when Mike uploaded the video, he titled it, "My Dad Taught Me to Build Again." The view count hit 6 figures in under a week. And still, Harold was in the garage the next day, notebook in hand, sketching the next version. Always building. Always flying. Not to escape the past. But to carry it forward, like wind beneath a set of wings wired not just for air, but for love, for legacy, and for those who needed to be reminded that they, too, were never too old to take off again. Harold never imagined his days would become this full again. Not full with obligation or the kind of noisy clutter that used to fill calendars in his younger years, but full with meaning, with motion, with the hum of purpose vibrating gently beneath the surface of everything. Mornings began earlier now, not because of habit or pain in his joints, but because he couldn't wait to see what messages had come in overnight. Sometimes it was Jamie sending a photo of a new drone prototype or a question about stabilizers, sometimes it was a widow from Wisconsin showing off her late husband's restored woodworking tools, or a grandfather in Texas who had started posting videos teaching his grandkids how to build radios from scratch. The channel had passed 100,000 subscribers now, something Harold never chased or expected, but when the little silver plaque came in the mail, he held it like it was a diploma he didn't realize he'd earned. He hung it near the old photo of him and Claire, right above the workbench. The Phoenix project had taken on a life of its own. Volunteers from all 50 states had joined the route now, each offering to host, track, and document a leg of the cross-country drone flight. Mike built a dedicated website to organize it all, complete with a real-time GPS map, a blog, and profiles of each participant. "We're not just flying a drone across America," he wrote in the mission statement, "we're connecting generations, one flight at a time." A tech magazine picked up the story and ran a headline that made Harold snort, "The grandfather who's rewiring retirement." The article was kind and respectful, but Harold still didn't feel like any kind of hero. He was just trying not to fade. The fact that other people saw themselves in his efforts made it all the more sacred. One of the first cross-country hosts was a woman named Doris, 73, from outside Flagstaff. She lived in a modest one-story with a large backyard that backed into Red Rock Hills. In her video submission, she explained that her late husband had been an RC plane hobbyist, but she'd always been too nervous to touch the controls. But after watching Mr. Winslow, she said, I figured it's never too late to put my hands on the sticks. The day she launched the Phoenix from her backyard, her hands were shaking, but the drone lifted smooth and easy into the blue Arizona sky, sunlight catching on its wings as it climbed. Harold watched it live from his garage, tears welling in his eyes. Doris's laughter echoed through the stream. I did it, she yelled. I really did it. It was the most joyful sound he'd heard in years. The drone landed perfectly. She waved at the camera, cheeks flushed pink, a look of triumph etched into every wrinkle. The comments flooded in. You go, Doris. My new hero. She just reminded me to stop making excuses. Harold emailed her personally. You didn't just fly, he wrote, you lit a torch. The next few legs went smoothly. Each participant checking in, sharing their footage, posting reflections. One by one, people who had been dormant began to stir. Harold received a message from a Vietnam veteran named Ray in Nebraska. Been sitting in this chair too long. Got my old ham radio up again. Listening to the world. Thanks for the nudge. Another from Elaine, a retired teacher in Maine. I always told my students to keep learning. Somewhere along the line, I stopped taking my own advice. Started painting again. It's messy. But it's mine. Each message filled Harold with something deeper than pride. It was a kind of spiritual oxygen. Proof that breath could still be found even in lungs weathered by decades. At night, he'd sit on the porch and read the letters out loud to himself, sometimes imagining Claire sitting beside him in her rocking chair, nodding with approval. You're making waves, he'd whisper. Can you believe that? He knew she would. She'd always believed in the deeper parts of him, the ones he had buried under duty, silence, and time. Mike became a near-constant presence, dropping by on weekends, bringing new tools, sharing tech articles, even designing a new launch ramp for future builds. They didn't talk much about the past, but sometimes they didn't need to. Healing came in shared tools, in the rhythm of building, in laughter over crooked parts and misread diagrams. Jamie called in for a video chat every Friday evening. Sometimes Harold would catch himself smiling halfway through their calls, thinking how odd it was that one of his closest friends was 14. But Jamie reminded him of something vital, how the mind, when sparked, could bridge any gap. The boy's room was always cluttered with gadgets, wires hanging from his ceiling like ivy, posters of rockets and blueprints on the walls. You know, Jamie said once, my mom thinks I'm learning more from you than from school. Harold chuckled. Tell her I'm just making it up as I go. Jamie grinned. That's what all the best teachers say. One day, while organizing parts for the next model, Harold found a small cardboard box tucked behind the old drill press. Inside were a dozen Polaroids from his early engineer days, shots of him and Claire at trade shows, a few of Mike as a toddler, and one of an early prototype drone that had never worked. He held that last one for a long time, staring at the crooked wings, the clunky design, the bright red smiley face someone, probably Claire, had drawn on its fuselage. It had never flown, but it had meant something. Maybe I needed to fail back then, he whispered. So I could fly now. He placed the photo beside the Firefly on the shelf, honoring the bridge between then and now. As the drone neared its halfway point in the cross-country journey, media attention started growing. Harold received an invitation to speak at a national conference for creative aging. The email subject line read, "Your story is inspiring thousands." At first, he hesitated. He wasn't a public speaker. He wasn't anyone special. But then he remembered what Elon had said in that podcast, the quote he scribbled down months ago, "You have to be willing to look like a fool if you're going to do something new. Otherwise, you're just living someone else's version of safety." He said yes. The speech took weeks to write. He rehearsed it alone in the garage, then in front of Mike, then over video chat with Jamie, who offered line edits and applause. The day of the event, Harold wore a pressed blazer and carried the original Firefly drone in a custom case like it was a crown jewel. The room was packed with gray heads and eager eyes. Some in wheelchairs, others leaning on canes, but all alert, curious, hungry for what came next. He stepped to the microphone. "My name is Harold Winslow," he began, "and I used to think getting older meant disappearing. I thought my best inventions were behind me. That my hands were too slow, my ideas too old, and my voice no longer needed. But I was wrong." He held up the drone. "This is what brought me back. Not because it's fast or sleek, but because it reminded me I still had something to offer. We all do." He spoke for 20 minutes. When he finished, the crowd stood. Not loud, not wild. Just steady applause, long and full. Afterward, a woman came up and touched his arm. "You made me remember who I was before I got scared," she said. "And I think I'm ready to try again." That night, Harold sat on his porch and let the wind wash over him. The drone was flying across Montana now, carried by a former firefighter who said he hadn't felt useful since retiring. "Thanks for reminding me," his message read. "Winds change. We can too." Harold leaned back in the chair Claire had once rocked in. He looked at the sky, at the space between stars, at the flight path of hope threading its way across the country. The wind rustled the pages of his notebook, where tomorrow's ideas waited. He smiled to himself. It wasn't just a second wind. It was the beginning of something vast, powerful, and unfinished. And he was ready. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The night after the speech, Harold didn't sleep. Not from anxiety or insomnia, but from a quiet, electric hum that filled his chest and wouldn't let him go. He sat at the kitchen table until dawn with a cup of lukewarm coffee and the conference badge still around his neck, fingers tracing the lanyard like it was some kind of metal. The video of his talk had already been uploaded, and the comments were flooding in faster than he could keep up. Words like, "bravery," "needed this," started crying halfway through, and one that stuck with him like an arrow straight through the ribs, "I haven't felt hope in years, and then tonight I did." That was the part he hadn't prepared for. Not the flying, not the fixing, not the building, that was second nature. But this other thing, this connection with people he'd never met, this strange intimacy between strangers, it was sacred in a way he couldn't explain. He was no preacher, no counselor, no savior. But something about his quiet rebellion against irrelevance had become a lifeline for people who didn't even know they were drowning. And for the first time in his life, Harold didn't just feel useful. He felt necessary. The Phoenix Project was in Idaho now, hosted by a father-daughter team who had lost their wife and mother just the year before. The daughter, maybe 12 years old, wore a red cap and held the controller with a look of fierce determination. "She always said we'd find our way back to joy," the father said in the video, voice trembling. "This is part of that." The drone rose like it had a soul. Smooth. Sure. The camera on board captured golden fields and mountain shadows, and when Harold saw it, he sat back in his chair and whispered, "You're flying more than just miles now." Mike came by the next day with takeout and a grin. "You're trending," he said. "Some TikTok creator made a whole tribute to you. Called you the grandfather of flight." Harold laughed. "That's a little much." "You've earned it," Mike said, setting down the food. "But you need to rest. You've been running full throttle since this started." Harold nodded, but deep down, he knew something else. He wasn't running, he was catching up. Catching up to himself, to the life that had waited quietly while he mourned, to the version of him that hadn't disappeared, only paused. But Mike was right. He was tired. The good kind of tired, like after a long day of planting in the garden, or sanding wood for hours until the grain came alive beneath your hands. Still, tired. So he took the next morning off. Slept until 8. Had breakfast on the porch. Read the paper without checking his phone. And for a moment, he remembered how still his life used to be, how he'd go days without a voice but his own, how the world had shrunk to the size of his grief. That stillness didn't scare him anymore, but he respected it. It had taught him what silence really was. And how much it cost when it lingered too long. Later that afternoon, an email came through that made him sit straighter in his chair. The subject line was, from a former student of Claire Winslow. The message was short. My name is Rebecca Myers. I had your wife in English class in 1989. She changed my life. I just saw your video online, and I knew I had to reach out. Would you ever be open to a call? Harold blinked at the screen, heart caught between pain and warmth. He hadn't spoken to one of Claire's students in decades. Her legacy had lived in notebooks and lesson plans, in the smell of old chalk and literature anthologies lined with post-its, but now, suddenly, it was knocking. He replied immediately. That evening, the call came through. Rebecca's voice was steady and soft, with the kind of careful strength that came from a life well examined. She spoke of Claire like she was still alive, and Harold didn't interrupt her. She told stories he'd never heard, how Claire stayed after school to help her write scholarship essays, how she once gave her a copy of Leaves of Grass with a note inside that said, "Don't let the world shrink your wonder." Harold smiled at that. It sounded exactly like her. Rebecca had gone on to become a professor. She ran a writing program for women starting over after incarceration. I just wanted you to know, she said finally, your wife helped me become who I am. And now you're helping me again, just in a different way. When the call ended, Harold sat with his hands folded in his lap for a long time. The ache in his chest was bittersweet, like sunlight through stained glass, beautiful, fractured, and holy. The Phoenix drone reached the West Coast 2 days later. It launched from a beach in Oregon, slicing through marine fog and the cries of seagulls, heading east toward the heartland once again. The mission was halfway done. But Harold knew, somehow, that the real journey was only beginning. He was sitting in the garage that night, sketching a new propulsion system, when Mike walked in holding a folder. Dad, he said slowly, there's something you should see. Inside were papers. Legal ones. From an engineering patent Claire had submitted in the early 2000s. Harold remembered now, an idea she'd worked on during her last few years, an educational toolkit that combined literature and mechanical design. Build a story, she called it. She'd pitched it to a few publishers but it had gone nowhere, and after her passing, Harold had boxed it away like so much else. But now, somehow, here it was again. You think we could finish it? Mike asked. Not just publish it. Build it. As a kit. Send it out to schools. Maybe even tie it into the Phoenix program. Harold ran his fingers over the worn paper, Claire's notes in her unmistakable cursive dancing along the margins. A tear dropped before he realized it. Yeah, he whispered. Yeah, let's finish it. Over the next few weeks, they worked on both fronts, the drone and the legacy project. They called the new initiative Flight and Fiction, combining drone kits with creative writing prompts for kids and seniors alike. Jamie joined in, helping design the tech side. A local librarian volunteered to pilot it in a community center. Suddenly, what started as one man fixing a drone had become a multi-generational education program. Letters poured in from all directions. You reminded me how to dream. My grandson and I built the kit together. First time he's looked me in the eye in months. I never knew my stories mattered. Until now. The Phoenix continued to fly. Its GPS path looked like a signature stretching across America. Reporters started calling. One asked Harold, why drones? Why now? Harold smiled. Because it's not really about drones. It's about giving people permission to matter again. And that was it. The truth of the whole thing. Not just for others. For himself. He'd spent too long thinking his usefulness had an expiration date. That his voice had passed its prime. But he was wrong. The world hadn't stopped needing him. He had just stopped answering. Until now. That evening, as the sun sank low over the rooftops and the Firefly drone rested quietly on its shelf, Harold stood in the center of the garage and looked around. Every shelf held stories. Every drawer carried echoes. But now, the space was alive again, not with nostalgia, but with purpose. The kind that doesn't fade with age but grows stronger, louder, and more certain when given the chance. He picked up a new frame from the table. Inside was the photo of Claire with the quote from her old note, "Don't let the world shrink your wonder." He hung it above the window. Then he turned back to the workbench and got back to building. Because the sky was still wide. The journey still long. And he, Harold Winslow, was not done flying. The next morning, Harold woke up with a dream still clinging to his thoughts like dew on glass. In it, Claire had been sitting at her old desk in the corner of the garage, surrounded by pages and coffee cups, her hair falling in front of her face the way it always did when she was focused. She hadn't spoken, just looked up and smiled like she used to when something worked, when an idea finally clicked into place. He sat with the dream for a moment, then walked to the garage and opened the folder Mike had brought over again. It smelled faintly of dust and time. Inside were sketches, lesson plans, diagrams, Claire's idea for Build a Story, a hands-on learning tool that used modular drone pieces to teach plot, character, and structure. She had always believed kids learned better when they could feel ideas with their fingers, not just their minds. One page in particular stopped him. It was a simple drawing, a tiny drone shaped like a paper airplane, with labels like Exposition on the nose, Conflict on the wings, and Resolution on the tail. In her handwriting, just beneath the sketch, were the words, "Every story needs lift." Harold stared at that for a long time. She was always ahead of her time, he whispered, running a finger along the edge of the paper. He scanned the notes into his computer and sent them to Jamie and Mike. Jamie responded first. "This is genius." Mike called 10 minutes later. "Dad, we can make this. Not just one. Hundreds. Maybe thousands. Schools need stuff like this." And Harold knew he was right. It was time to take Claire's blueprint and bring it to life. The first step was designing the prototype. Harold cleared a section of the garage workbench and set aside all other projects. The Phoenix was still flying, but the cross-country team had it handled now, like a relay passed to trusted hands. This next mission was personal. He began by sketching out the drone itself, lightweight, safe, easy to assemble without tools. The modules would snap together with color-coded connectors, each part corresponding to a storytelling element, setting, character, rising action, and so on. Claire had already outlined the framework, he just needed to modernize it. Jamie offered to code the companion app. "We'll make it simple," he said, excited. A kid scans the drone with a phone, and it walks them through building both the drone and their story. Mike began researching small-scale manufacturing. He'd been working in software for years but had friends who built educational products, and within days, they had a short list of suppliers, laser cutters, and 3D print shops who might help. For Harold, the rhythm was familiar but entirely new. He was building with Claire, even if she wasn't physically there. Every step felt like a conversation, every adjustment a way of saying "I see you, I hear you, I remember." He began reading her old journals again, too. He hadn't touched them in years. They were lined with margin notes, half-finished poems, and reminders to call former students. On one page, scribbled between two Shakespeare quotes, was this: "We don't get to choose when the world listens. We only choose whether to keep speaking. That became the tagline for the project. They called it Sky Story. Harold created a short announcement video. He stood in front of the workbench with Claire's blueprints on the wall behind him and spoke simply, from the heart. Years ago, my wife dreamed of a way to teach kids that stories don't just live on paper. She wanted them to build narratives they could hold, fly, feel. She passed before it could happen. But today, we're finishing it. Because her ideas still have lift. And because every story deserves a chance to take off. The video spread fast. Educators shared it, literacy nonprofits reached out, parents emailed asking how they could order a kit. A crowdfunding campaign launched with a modest $10,000 goal. It passed $50,000 in 2 days. Then $100,000 by the end of the week. One comment read, "My daughter struggles with dyslexia. She saw this and said, I want to build a story like that." That's the first time she's smiled about reading in months. Harold printed that one and pinned it next to Claire's "Every Story Needs Lift" sketch. The garage filled with prototypes. Different shapes, materials, battery types. Mike and Jamie would stop by and test fly them in the backyard. Sometimes the neighbors would watch from their porches, clapping when a model flew clean and smooth. The whole block knew now, Harold was building something for the world. And it was built with love. The first classroom trial came a month later. A local elementary school invited Harold, Mike, and Jamie to run a pilot program. 20 kids, ages 10 to 12, gathered in the school gym. Harold wore his usual button-up shirt and old jeans but walked in like a man with a mission. He brought the kits, laid them out, and watched as kids tore into them with the wide-eyed wonder he hadn't seen in decades. Each group built their drone, answered questions about who their main character was, what challenge the drone faced, how it would overcome it. And then, one by one, they flew their stories. Harold stood in the middle of the gym, heart pounding, eyes wet, as stories rose into the air, some zigzagging, some climbing straight up, some tumbling and recovering. Laughter echoed off the walls. One kid shouted, "My story's about a robot who doesn't think he's good enough, but then he learns to fly." Harold whispered, "That's all of us, kid." The principal pulled him aside afterward. "Mr. Winslow," she said, "I haven't seen these kids this engaged in anything all year." Harold nodded slowly. They just needed to be reminded they could build something. And that their voice has wings. That night, the Sky Story site crashed from traffic. Orders poured in. Donations from former students of Claire's, educators who remembered her name, and strangers who just believed in the mission. One message stood out. It was from a retired teacher named Alice. She wrote, "I taught for 40 years and thought my best days were behind me. Then I saw this. I'd like to volunteer. I'd like to help stories fly again." Harold read it aloud to the empty garage and said, "You're hired." They added a volunteer section to the site. Within a week, 50 retired educators had signed up. Claire's blueprint wasn't just a program now, it was a movement. One evening, after shipping out another round of prototypes, Harold sat on the porch watching the sun dip low over the houses. The wind picked up. The kind of soft wind that carried memory. He pulled out Claire's notebook and read a line he hadn't noticed before. "The sky is not just up. It's forward." He smiled. "You knew, didn't you? You knew this would fly." The Phoenix drone reached its final leg the following weekend. A boy in a wheelchair launched it from a mountaintop in North Carolina with his grandfather's help. The boy said his drone story was about a kid who didn't think he could go anywhere until he built something that could. It soared. The final flight. Across the sky. Across the country. Across every fear Harold had once believed about being too late. Too old. Too forgotten. He watched the live stream in silence. Then stood. Went to the garage. And began sketching again. Because there were still more stories to lift. More people to remind. More skies to chase. Claire's blueprint had become his compass. And it pointed only one way, forward. Harold sat alone in his study late into the night, the soft glow of his desk lamp illuminating a pile of handwritten letters and emails. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant hum of the city beyond his window. For years, his voice had been little more than a whisper, a fading echo lost in the noise of the world. But now, it was returning, louder and clearer than he could have imagined. The unexpected surge of connection through the SkyStory project had reopened something inside him, a well of expression that had been buried beneath grief and self-doubt for far too long. He picked up a letter from a woman named Doris, who had written about rebuilding her life after a stroke. "Your story reminded me that I still have words worth sharing," she wrote. "I started journaling again." Harold smiled softly. It wasn't just the kids or the tech or the drones. It was the voices he was helping awaken. The ones that had been silenced by time, pain, or fear. He reached for his old typewriter, the one Claire had used when she was alive, a relic from another era with keys worn smooth from decades of use. He hadn't typed on it in years, but tonight he was compelled to. The clack of the keys filled the room, a rhythm both familiar and new. He wrote about the journey, the doubts, the small victories, the way Elon Musk's words had first sparked his courage. He wrote about Claire, her dreams, and how her legacy had become the blueprint for something greater. Writing felt like breathing again. His fingers stumbled at times, but the words kept coming, spilling onto the page like a river breaking free from a dam. The next morning, Mike found Harold still at the desk, the typewriter ribbon almost empty. "You okay, Dad?" Mike asked, leaning in the doorway. Harold looked up, eyes bright. "Better than okay. I think I'm finding my voice again." Mike grinned. "Good. The world needs to hear it." Inspired, Harold began a weekly newsletter for the growing SkyStory community. He shared progress updates, stories from participants, and reflections on aging, resilience, and purpose. Each edition was infused with honesty, his own fears, failures, and hopes laid bare. The response was immediate and heartfelt. Messages poured in from all over the country, some from people decades younger, others well past retirement, all touched by his words. One reader wrote, "You make me believe it's never too late to start again." Another said, "Your story gave me the courage to call my daughter after years of silence." Harold realized this was more than just a newsletter, it was a bridge connecting lonely hearts, a chorus of voices rising together. The SkyStory kits were now shipping to schools, libraries, and senior centers nationwide. Harold traveled to speak at conferences and workshops, sharing the project's vision and listening to others' stories. Each trip refilled his well of inspiration and deepened his conviction that purpose knows no age limit. At a community center in Kansas City, he met Rose, a retired nurse with a passion for storytelling. She told him how she used SkyStory to help fellow seniors write and fly their life stories, finding healing and joy in the process. "You've given us wings, Harold," she said with tears in her eyes. Those words stayed with him. The voice that had once been silent was now lifting others, setting them free. Yet, even as the momentum built, Harold faced moments of doubt. The weight of legacy, the fear of failing Claire's vision, the pressure of public attention, they all pressed down like a storm on his shoulders. One evening, after a long day of meetings, he found himself staring out the window at the stars. The sky was vast, endless, and humbling. He thought of Elon Musk's relentless pursuit of the impossible, of defying limits, of dreaming bigger. It wasn't about fame or fortune, it was about daring to push boundaries, no matter the cost or the clock. Harold realized then that the true power of his voice wasn't just in what he said, but in the courage to speak at all. To be vulnerable. To show up every day, even when the future felt uncertain. The next morning, renewed, he decided to record a series of short videos for the SkyStory social media channels. No scripts, just honest conversations about aging, hope, and reinvention. If you're feeling invisible or too old to change, he said in one clip, I'm here to tell you, you're wrong. It's never too late. Your story is still unfolding. Your voice still matters. The videos resonated deeply, sparking conversations across platforms and breaking through the silence that too often surrounds older adults. Harold watched the comments flood in, people sharing their fears, their dreams, their moments of courage. A community was forming, woven together by the threads of shared experience and newfound hope. One afternoon, Jamie surprised Harold with a new project, a podcast series featuring interviews with SkyStory participants and experts on aging, creativity, and technology. It's another way to give voice to those stories, Jamie explained. Harold agreed immediately. Together, they brainstormed ideas and scheduled guests, eager to amplify the voices that needed to be heard. As the podcast launched, Harold felt a renewed sense of mission. This was more than a project, it was a movement. A chance to rewrite the narrative about aging, to challenge society's limits and stereotypes. To show that transformation was not the province of youth alone. One episode featured a woman named Eleanor, who at 78 had taken up drone flying in creative writing after watching Harold's talk. She described how the SkyStory program had helped her reconnect with her estranged grandson. Another guest was a tech innovator who spoke about the importance of designing accessible tools for all ages. Listening to these stories, Harold was reminded again of why he had started. It wasn't about drones or gadgets, it was about people. Their struggles, their triumphs, their refusal to fade away. Yet, despite the progress, Harold knew the journey wasn't over. There were still barriers. Physical, emotional, societal, that many faced. So he continued to push, to innovate, to reach out. One afternoon, as he was preparing for a keynote speech, he received a call that shook him. It was from Jamie. Dad, you need to see this. On the screen was a viral video clip, a news segment about a 70-year-old woman in Detroit who had built a SkyStory drone and used it to send messages of hope across her neighborhood during a difficult time. The story had captured hearts nationwide. Harold felt a swell of pride and humility. This was the ripple effect, one voice inspiring another, stories lifting off into the world, carrying light where there had been darkness. He took a deep breath and whispered to himself, "This is why we fly." Later that night, Harold sat down with Claire's old journal again. He traced the faded ink with reverence. One entry stood out, "The hardest part is believing you still have something to give. But once you do, the sky is the limit." Harold smiled through tears. He wasn't done giving. Not by a long shot. The voice that had been lost was back, stronger, clearer, and filled with purpose. And this time, it wasn't just his story. It was all of theirs. Harold stood outside the community center in Springfield, watching a small group of local seniors gather around a table covered in SkyStory kits. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and morning dew, and the sun cast long shadows over the parking lot. This was the latest chapter in a journey that had begun with a blueprint, a spark, and a longing to find meaning beyond loss. He had been invited here by Marlene, a retired schoolteacher who had become an ambassador for the project in her town. She greeted him with a warm hug and introduced him to the group, people from all walks of life, each carrying their own stories, fears, and hopes. Harold watched as they tentatively picked up the drone pieces, fingers tracing the colored connectors, eyes lighting with curiosity. He saw a spark he hadn't expected, an eagerness to not only build the drones but to share what their stories meant. One man, George, a former mechanic with arthritis in his hands, carefully assembled his drone, explaining aloud that his story was about fixing broken things, not just machines but relationships. "I'm trying to rebuild bridges with my kids," he said quietly. Harold nodded, moved by the honesty. "That's exactly why we do this," he said. "Because it's never too late to fix what matters." As the group prepared to fly their stories, Harold noticed a young volunteer named Elena helping an older woman adjust her drone. Elena explained that she was a college student studying gerontology and had volunteered to bridge the gap between generations. Harold realized this was another layer of the movement. Bringing young and old together through shared creativity. Then, just as George launched his drone into the crisp spring air, a sudden gust caught it off guard. The drone wobbled, dipped, and crashed hard onto the pavement. Gasps filled the air. George looked down, disappointed. Harold stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on George's shoulder. "It's okay. Sometimes, the best flights come after a crash." He crouched and picked up the drone, inspecting it carefully. The damage was minor. The motor still worked. Harold handed it back to George with a smile. "Try again." George nodded, determination flickering in his eyes. The second flight was steadier, soaring higher and straighter than before. Applause erupted from the crowd. It was a small victory but a powerful one. Harold thought about the flights he had witnessed over the past months, the successful launches, the crashes, the recoveries. Each flight mirrored life itself, full of uncertainty but ripe with possibility. After the session, Marlene invited Harold to join her for coffee at a nearby cafe. The place was cozy, filled with the scent of roasted beans and soft jazz playing on the speakers. Marlene shared stories of how SkyStory had reignited passion in her town, inspiring new friendships and even local art projects based on the stories shared. "You've started something bigger than you know," she said warmly. Harold felt a swell of gratitude. But then Marlene's tone shifted. "There's one thing you should know. Not everyone is on board." Harold frowned, curious. "What do you mean?" "Some folks think this is just a gadget, a toy for the young pretending to care. They don't see the value in older people learning new tech or telling stories. They say it's a waste of resources." Harold nodded, familiar with the skepticism. "I hear that a lot." Marlene leaned forward. "You have to be ready for resistance. But I believe your story, your voice, is the antidote to that. Keep sharing it." That evening, back at home, Harold reflected on the challenge. The path of change was never easy, especially when it pushed against deeply held beliefs about aging and usefulness. But he was reminded of Elon Musk's refusal to accept limits, how every setback was just a prompt to try harder, think differently. He opened his laptop and drafted a new blog post addressing the criticism. He wrote about the importance of fighting ageism, about the untapped potential in every generation, and about how stories could transform not just individuals but entire communities. The post went live and immediately sparked discussion. Some comments were supportive, sharing their own experiences of being underestimated because of age. Others were skeptical or dismissive. Harold welcomed it all. Dialogue was the first step toward change. Over the next weeks, Harold and his team organized a SkyStory Challenge, a contest inviting people of all ages to create and share their drone stories online. The goal was to build visibility, bridge generational divides, and showcase the impact of storytelling on resilience and connection. Entries poured in from across the country, children, retirees, families, veterans, teachers, all united by the simple act of building and flying stories. One submission stood out, a video from a man named Carl, a Vietnam veteran in his 70s, who narrated his story of healing from trauma through SkyStory. His voice was steady but emotional, and his drone soared against a backdrop of golden fields. The video went viral. Carl's story resonated deeply, inspiring conversations about mental health, aging, and hope. Harold received calls from journalists, podcasts, and advocacy groups asking to share the project. The unexpected flight of SkyStory had taken off far beyond the garage. But with the spotlight came pressure. Harold found himself navigating interviews, fundraising, and public speaking, new roles that stretched him but also renewed his sense of purpose. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling day, he sat in his study, exhausted and questioning if he could keep up. His phone buzzed, a text from Jamie, "Remember why you started?" Harold smiled, the simple reminder like a lifeline. He thought back to the nights with Claire, her unwavering belief in stories' power to heal and transform. He thought of the letters, the emails, the people whose lives had changed. And he knew he had to keep flying. The next big step came unexpectedly. A national educational nonprofit invited SkyStory to partner on a program for underprivileged youth. It was an opportunity to bring the project into schools that desperately needed creative outlets and support. Harold accepted with enthusiasm. He and Jamie began developing a scaled version of the kits, more affordable and adaptable to different learning environments. Mike coordinated logistics, while volunteers like Elena trained teachers and mentors. The first pilot school was in Detroit, a city with its own history of resilience and reinvention. Harold visited the school, meeting kids whose faces lit up as they built their drones and told their stories. One girl, Amina, shy and reserved, shared how she wrote about a girl who learned to fly even when others doubted her. Her drone took off with surprising grace. Harold felt tears prick at his eyes. This was the unexpected flight, the flight of hope, connection, and second chances. As SkyStory expanded, Harold noticed something else changing, his own relationship with aging. The fear that had once haunted him was giving way to acceptance and even celebration. He embraced the idea that growth wasn't limited to youth, that every day held new possibilities to learn, create, and connect. One evening, after a community event where several seniors shared their SkyStory journeys, Harold stood outside under a clear sky. He looked up at the stars and whispered, "This is only the beginning." A breeze stirred the leaves, carrying with it the promise of more stories, more flights, more lives lifted. The unexpected flight had transformed not just the project but Harold himself. He was no longer the man haunted by loss and doubt but a man propelled by purpose, community, and the enduring power of stories. And somewhere, he believed, Claire was smiling too, her blueprint guiding them all toward horizons yet unseen. Harold stood on the porch of his small suburban home, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow over the neighborhood. The breeze stirred the leaves, and the familiar hum of distant lawnmowers blended with the chirping of birds settling in for the evening. It was a moment of calm, yet beneath the surface, a storm of transformation was brewing. The SkyStory project had grown beyond anything Harold had imagined, but with growth came new challenges, and new questions. As he sipped his coffee, Harold thought about how much had changed in the past year. He was no longer the man who had sat alone in his study, doubting his relevance and voice. Now, he was a connector of stories, a catalyst for change. Yet he knew that transformation wasn't just about progress, it was about confronting the winds of resistance that always seemed to blow harder when you dared to fly higher. The winds had already been felt. From skeptical colleagues to critical media voices, the narrative of aging was still burdened by assumptions and prejudice. Harold had witnessed firsthand the subtle, and sometimes blatant, dismissal of older adults as fragile, irrelevant, or incapable of innovation. But the stories he had heard, the lives he had touched, proved otherwise. He believed deeply that these winds could be redirected, that the very forces resisting change were ripe for transformation. That belief was the fuel for his next bold step. Harold had been invited to a national summit on aging and innovation, a gathering of experts, activists, and entrepreneurs determined to rethink what it meant to grow older in America. He prepared a keynote speech that spoke from the heart, about loss and hope, failure and courage, invisibility and impact. About how the SkyStory drones were more than machines, they were vessels carrying the stories, dreams, and renewed purpose of a generation often overlooked. On the morning of the summit, Harold felt a familiar flutter of nerves. Standing backstage, he glanced out at the packed auditorium filled with faces eager to hear his message. Among the crowd were people from his own generation, as well as younger advocates who recognized the urgency of changing the aging narrative. As he took the stage, he thought back to Elon Musk's words, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." Those words echoed in his mind as he spoke with clarity and passion. He shared the journeys of individuals who had taken flight through SkyStory, their stories woven into a tapestry of resilience and reinvention. The audience responded with standing ovations and heartfelt applause. But it wasn't just applause Harold sought, it was change. After the speech, he was approached by Dr. Elaine Reynolds, a respected gerontologist and policy advisor. She told Harold that his work was exactly the kind of innovation needed to influence public policy and reshape community programs for older adults. "We need to think beyond healthcare and social services," she said. "We need to invest in purpose, creativity, and intergenerational connection. Projects like yours are a model." Encouraged, Harold and Elaine began discussing ways to collaborate. Together, they envisioned a pilot program integrating SkyStory into public health initiatives, aiming to improve mental wellness and social engagement among seniors. Back home, Harold felt energized but also aware of the stakes. This was no longer just a personal mission, it was a movement with the power to shift systems and perceptions. But even as doors opened, the winds of change stirred skepticism in unexpected places. One afternoon, during a meeting with a potential funding partner, Harold encountered resistance. The executive, while polite, expressed doubts about the scalability of SkyStory and questioned whether older adults truly wanted to engage with technology. "Is this really the priority for this demographic?" the executive asked. Harold held his ground, sharing data and personal stories that illustrated the profound impact the project had on mental health, community building, and lifelong learning. He spoke about the hidden hunger for purpose and connection that many older adults felt. The conversation was tense but respectful. Harold left the meeting knowing the battle for recognition and resources was far from over. Still, he refused to let doubt dim his resolve. That evening, he reflected on the winds of change swirling around him and thought of a quote he had once heard Elon Musk say, "Persistence is very important. You should not give up unless you are forced to give up." Harold decided then that persistence would be his compass. He reached out to leaders in aging advocacy, tech innovation, and education, forging new partnerships that expanded SkyStory's reach and impact. Jamie organized a nationwide volunteer network, training facilitators to bring the program into more communities, including rural areas often overlooked by innovation. The ripple effect was becoming a wave. Meanwhile, Harold's own personal life was shifting too. Mike had moved into a new apartment downtown, pursuing a career in urban planning inspired partly by his father's passion for community building. Their relationship, once strained by distance and grief, had softened into something steady and hopeful. Jamie, balancing college and the growing demands of SkyStory, had become a vital partner in every sense, bringing youthful energy and fresh ideas to the project. One weekend, the family gathered for a barbecue in Harold's backyard. Laughter and conversation filled the air, blending old stories with new dreams. Harold looked around and felt a profound sense of gratitude. The winds of change had blown hard, but they had also carried seeds of growth and healing. Yet, amid the successes, Harold remained grounded by a quiet truth: aging was not a linear path but a complex, often unpredictable journey. Some days were filled with joy and accomplishment, others with frustration and fatigue. He had learned to listen to his body and mind, honoring limits without surrendering to them. He continued daily walks through the neighborhood, sometimes accompanied by neighbors or old friends who had become part of the SkyStory community. These walks were more than exercise, they were moments of reflection, connection, and renewal. During one such walk, Harold stopped at the park bench where he had once sat feeling invisible and defeated. Now, he sat with a notebook in hand, jotting down ideas for a new project, a mentorship program connecting older adults with youth through storytelling and technology. The idea thrilled him: another way to build bridges, spark curiosity, and nurture purpose across generations. As summer deepened, Harold traveled to Washington, D.C., to participate in a panel discussion on aging innovation. Surrounded by policymakers, researchers, and advocates, he spoke candidly about the importance of hope and imagination in crafting policies that honored the full humanity of older adults. The conversation was lively and hopeful, a sign that the winds were indeed shifting. One night in D.C., as Harold walked back to his hotel beneath a canopy of city lights, he paused to look up at the sky. The stars were dimmed by the glow of the metropolis, but he could still see a few twinkling, reminders of the vastness beyond. He thought about Elon Musk's dreams of reaching Mars, of pushing humanity's limits. Harold smiled, realizing that while his own ambitions were more grounded, they shared the same core, the refusal to accept boundaries, the belief that we are always capable of more. Back home, the fall brought a flurry of new activity. Harold and Jamie launched the mentorship program, pairing teens with seniors to co-create SkyStory projects. The results were inspiring, young people gaining wisdom and perspective, older adults rediscovering their voices and passions. One mentor pair, 17-year-old Lucas and 72-year-old Harriet, had created a drone story about overcoming fear and finding friendship across generations. Their project won a regional award and was featured in a local news segment. Harold watched the broadcast with pride and awe. The winds of change were no longer subtle, they were a force carrying stories, hopes, and dreams into the future. Yet, Harold also recognized the need for balance. Amid the flurry of innovation and expansion, he carved out time for quiet moments, reading, gardening, and simply being. These moments grounded him and reminded him that aging was as much about inner growth as external achievement. One evening, as he tended to his rose bushes, Harold felt a familiar ache in his knees but also a deep sense of peace. He whispered a thank you to Claire, to Elon's example, and to the countless voices that had carried him this far. The journey was far from over, but Harold was ready for whatever winds lay ahead. Because now he knew, the winds of change, though unpredictable, could be harnessed to lift us higher, if only we dared to fly. Harold's world was expanding in ways he never imagined possible. The SkyStory project had taken on a life of its own, reaching communities, schools, and hearts beyond the borders of his quiet town. But with expansion came new challenges, new horizons to cross, both external and internal. On a crisp autumn morning, Harold boarded a plane bound for Seattle. The invitation had come unexpectedly, a technology conference featuring innovators and thinkers dedicated to reinventing aging. As the plane soared above the clouds, Harold looked out the window at the endless sky, reflecting on how far he had come. Years ago, he might have felt anxious or unworthy of such an invitation, but now he felt a quiet confidence, rooted in experience and purpose. The conference hall buzzed with energy when he arrived. People of all ages mingled, some entrepreneurs, some activists, some curious seekers like Harold himself. He felt a mix of excitement and humility as he prepared to share his story and listen to others. His keynote speech was scheduled for the second day, giving him time to absorb the ideas and conversations swirling around him. One session stood out, a panel on the future of work for older adults. The panelists discussed how technology was reshaping careers and how society needed to rethink retirement and contribution. Harold listened intently as speakers emphasized the importance of lifelong learning and adaptability. After the session, a young woman approached him. "I loved your project," she said, introducing herself as Maya, a software engineer working on AI tools for accessibility. "I think there's so much potential in what you're doing to connect generations." They talked for a long while, exchanging ideas and possibilities. Maya was excited about integrating voice recognition and AI storytelling into SkyStory to make it more accessible to people with limited mobility or vision challenges. Harold was energized by her enthusiasm and expertise. The next day, as he stepped onto the stage, Harold felt the weight of the moment but also a thrill. He shared not only the story of SkyStory but also his own personal journey, from despair to hope, from invisibility to impact. He spoke about the power of purpose, the courage to try, and the refusal to be defined by age. The audience responded with warmth and curiosity, many approaching him afterward with questions and ideas. One man, a venture capitalist, expressed interest in funding the next phase of SkyStory's technology development. It was an opportunity Harold hadn't anticipated but was eager to explore. Outside the formal sessions, Harold found himself drawn to a small art installation in the lobby, a mural depicting faces of older adults from diverse backgrounds, each surrounded by symbols of dreams and resilience. The artist, a woman named Rosa, explained that she had created it to celebrate the richness of later life. Harold felt a deep connection to the artwork, seeing in it a reflection of the very spirit he hoped to nurture through his work. That evening, as the conference wound down, Harold and Maya discussed plans for collaboration. They envisioned a new SkyStory platform. One that would blend drones, storytelling, and accessible technology to reach even more people, including those in assisted living and rehabilitation centers. Harold was struck by how technology could be a bridge rather than a barrier, a tool for empowerment rather than exclusion. Back home, the excitement of the conference translated into action. Harold and Jamie set up virtual meetings with Maya and other new partners, strategizing how to develop the next generation of SkyStory. Mike, now working on urban community projects, offered insights on how to integrate the program into city initiatives aimed at social inclusion. The family was united in purpose, their individual paths converging around this shared mission. But amid the flurry of progress, Harold also encountered moments of doubt. He noticed the toll the busy schedule took on his health and energy. Some nights he struggled to fall asleep, his mind racing with ideas and worries. There were times when the magnitude of the work felt overwhelming, and the fear of failure crept in. Yet, each morning, he returned to his practice of mindfulness, breathing deeply, grounding himself in the present, and reminding himself of the core truth he had learned: transformation was a journey, not a destination. One afternoon, Harold received an email from a woman named Denise, a librarian in a rural town in Ohio. She shared how she had started a SkyStory club at her library, bringing together older adults who rarely left their homes. She described how the program had sparked joy, conversation, and new friendships. Harold was touched. Stories like Denise's reminded him of the far-reaching impact of small acts of courage and creativity. Inspired, he wrote back, offering support and ideas to help Denise grow her program. That week, Harold was invited to appear on a popular podcast focusing on aging and technology. The host, a sharp and empathetic interviewer, challenged Harold to speak honestly about the fears and frustrations that often accompanied aging, and about how SkyStory was a beacon of hope. During the conversation, Harold found himself opening up more than he expected. He spoke of his grief for Claire, the loneliness he had felt, and the moments when he questioned if he still mattered. But he also spoke of the redemption he had found in purpose, community, and daring to fly again. The episode resonated widely, drawing messages from listeners who shared their own stories of loss, hope, and transformation. Harold realized that vulnerability was a powerful connector, breaking down walls and inspiring others to step forward. As fall deepened into winter, Harold prepared for the next big milestone, a national SkyStory summit that would bring together participants, partners, and supporters from across the country. The summit was more than a celebration, it was a chance to reflect, learn, and chart the path forward. The event was held at a sprawling conference center nestled among snow-dusted pines. Participants arrived with excitement and curiosity, eager to share their projects and hear from one another. Workshops buzzed with energy, and the air was filled with laughter, storytelling, and the hum of drones taking flight. Harold watched as seniors taught teens how to pilot their SkyStories, while young people helped elders navigate new technology with patience and respect. It was a vibrant tapestry of connection and possibility. During the closing ceremony, Harold stepped onto the stage to deliver the keynote. He looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, many new, and felt a surge of gratitude. "We began with a simple idea," he said, "that stories have the power to heal, connect, and transform. But what we've learned is that transformation isn't just about changing ourselves, it's about changing the world around us. Together, we are crossing new horizons, breaking boundaries of age, technology, and fear." The room erupted in applause. After the summit, Harold took a quiet moment outside, gazing at the starry sky. The cold air was crisp against his face, but he felt warm inside. The journey had been long and sometimes difficult, but the path ahead was wide open. He thought of Elon Musk's relentless pursuit of what others deemed impossible. Like Musk, Harold had learned that true innovation required vision, resilience, and a willingness to embrace uncertainty. But above all, it required heart. Back home, as winter settled in, Harold found comfort in simple routines: warm cups of tea, quiet evenings by the fire, and phone calls with Jamie and Mike. He continued to nurture the SkyStory community, even as he recognized the importance of balance. One afternoon, as snowflakes drifted outside his window, Harold received a letter from a woman named Evelyn, a widow in her 80s who had recently completed her first SkyStory project. She wrote about how the process had given her a renewed sense of purpose and joy. Harold felt a profound sense of connection across time and distance. The winds of change had carried him to new horizons, but it was the stories, the lives touched, the voices heard, that made the journey meaningful. As the new year approached, Harold set new goals. To deepen partnerships, expand access to SkyStory, and continue evolving the technology with inclusivity at its core. But he also vowed to honor the lessons learned, the need for patience, self-care, and the courage to keep dreaming, no matter the season of life. One evening, as he sat by the fire reflecting on the past months, Harold whispered to the quiet room, "This is what Claire always believed, that it's never too late to begin again." And in that moment, surrounded by memories and dreams, Harold knew he was exactly where he was meant to be, crossing new horizons with hope, courage, and a heart wide open. Harold woke up to the soft light filtering through the curtains of his bedroom, the familiar creak of the old wooden floor beneath his feet grounding him in a place that felt both comfortingly known and charged with new possibility. Outside, the maple tree in his front yard had turned a fiery red, its leaves fluttering down in the gentle autumn breeze. The seasons were changing, and Harold felt a stirring inside him that mirrored the world's rhythms, a tug between the deep roots of his past and the wide wings of his future. He had spent months expanding SkyStory, crossing new horizons with a team of passionate collaborators, but now a quiet question had begun to surface: how could he honor where he came from even as he reached for what lay ahead? This question felt personal and universal. Aging, Harold had come to understand, was not just about moving forward or letting go. It was about integrating the past with the present, finding strength in memory and history while daring to soar toward new dreams. That morning, Harold decided to visit his childhood hometown, a small Midwestern town nestled along a winding river, where time seemed to slow and stories lingered in every corner. It had been decades since he'd been there, and he knew the journey would be more than just a physical return, it would be a pilgrimage to the roots of who he was. The drive through rolling hills and amber fields brought a flood of memories: the schoolhouse where he had learned to read, the old diner where he and Claire had shared their first date, the oak tree he'd climbed as a boy dreaming of the stars. As he walked the familiar streets, Harold felt a bittersweet mix of joy and sorrow. Some faces and places were gone, replaced by new buildings and strangers. Yet, the essence of the town, the quiet resilience, the spirit of community, remained alive in the air. At the local library, Harold met with Mrs. Thompson, the librarian who had been a mentor during his youth. She was now in her 80s, but her eyes sparkled with the same warmth and curiosity he remembered. They talked for hours about the power of stories, the importance of preserving history, and the role of technology in connecting generations. Mrs. Thompson shared that many older residents felt invisible in the rapidly changing town, isolated as families moved away and younger generations chased urban dreams. Harold listened carefully, his heart swelling with a familiar resolve. This was the perfect place to plant new seeds, where SkyStory could bridge past and present, roots and wings. Inspired, Harold proposed a community project to Mrs. Thompson, a SkyStory archive, where residents could share their memories, photos, and dreams using drones and digital storytelling tools. Together, they imagined transforming the library into a hub of intergenerational connection, where young volunteers would help elders tell their stories and build new ones. News of the project spread quickly, and Harold found himself surrounded by eager participants, retirees, teens, teachers, and local officials, each bringing their own hopes and talents. As the project took shape, Harold was reminded that growth often began with listening deeply and valuing what already existed. One afternoon, as he worked alongside a group of seniors learning to pilot drones, Harold met Ruth, a retired schoolteacher with a sharp wit and a wealth of stories. Ruth had been reluctant at first, unsure about the technology, but soon she was leading the group with enthusiasm. She shared tales of her own journey. How she had lost her husband years ago and struggled with loneliness but found new purpose in mentoring neighborhood kids. Watching Ruth and others blossom through the project filled Harold with profound gratitude. It was a living testament to the idea that roots could nourish wings, that honoring the past could fuel the courage to fly. Meanwhile, back home, Jamie and Mike supported the effort remotely, coordinating virtual workshops and fundraising efforts. The family's bond grew stronger, their shared mission a source of joy and strength. Harold also found time for quiet reflection. He spent evenings writing in his journal, capturing the stories he heard and the lessons he learned. He thought about Claire and the life they had built, the love, the struggles, and the dreams that still inspired him. One night, as the wind whispered through the trees, Harold penned a line that felt like a revelation: to fly, we must first know where we come from. As winter approached, the project reached a milestone, the first community Sky Story Festival, held in the library's renovated hall. The space was transformed with photographs, art, and screens displaying drone footage of cherished places and faces. The air was electric with excitement as residents shared their stories, celebrated their heritage, and embraced the possibilities ahead. Harold watched as children listened wide-eyed to elders recounting tales of resilience and hope, as neighbors connected across generations through shared experiences. The festival was more than an event, it was a reclaiming of identity and purpose. Harold took the stage to speak, his voice steady but full of emotion. "We are more than the years behind us," he said. "We are the stories we carry, the love we give, and the dreams we dare to chase. This community is proof that roots and wings can coexist, that honoring our past makes our future stronger." The applause was thunderous, but Harold knew the real victory was the renewed sense of belonging and possibility in the room. In the following weeks, Harold received letters and calls from participants expressing how the project had changed their lives. Some had found peace by revisiting old memories, others discovered new passions, many simply felt seen and heard. One letter stood out. It was from a young woman named Emily, who had helped her grandmother create a sky story about overcoming hardship and finding joy in the small moments. Emily wrote, "Thank you for showing us that age is not a limit but a doorway." Harold smiled, feeling the profound truth in her words. The winds of change were carrying stories that transcended time. Yet, as always, challenges remained. Funding was tight, and sustaining momentum required constant effort. Harold also faced his own limits, moments of fatigue, frustration, and fear of losing what had been built. But the roots he had strengthened gave him resilience. He remembered a conversation with Elon Musk, who once said, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." This mantra became Harold's anchor as he navigated the complexities of growth and aging. One snowy evening, as Harold sat by the fire reflecting on the journey, he realized that the greatest lesson of all was the delicate balance between holding on and letting go, between honoring history and embracing transformation. Aging was not a surrender but a dance between roots and wings, a lifelong journey of integration and renewal. In that quiet moment, Harold whispered a promise to himself. To keep listening, learning, and flying, with the past as his foundation and the future as his horizon. Harold stood at the edge of the dock, the chilly morning air wrapping around him like a crisp reminder that life was always moving forward, regardless of age. The lake before him was a smooth mirror reflecting the soft pinks and golds of dawn, yet beneath the surface, currents swirled invisibly. Just like life, he thought. Beneath calm appearances, uncertainty and change churned constantly. Today was the day he had decided to take a leap, not just metaphorically, but quite literally. The community project had grown beyond anything he'd ever imagined, but now it demanded something more personal, more daring from him. A local organization was hosting a charity fundraiser, a lake jump event to raise money for intergenerational programs, including SkyStory. Participants were to dive into the cold water, symbolizing a commitment to embracing change and overcoming fear. At first, Harold had been hesitant. The idea of plunging into icy water seemed reckless, even foolish for a man in his 70s. His body ached more often now, and the doctor's warnings about heart health echoed in his mind. But then he thought about Elon Musk's words he had recently read in an interview: if you're trying to create a better future, you have to be willing to take risks that scare you. The ones that feel impossible. The ones that say, "Are you sure you can do this?" Harold felt a spark ignite inside him. This was his moment, a leap of faith to show himself and others that courage didn't diminish with age, it could even grow stronger. The night before the event, Harold barely slept. His mind raced with doubts and what-ifs. Would his body hold up? Would people think he was crazy? Would he let them down? But deep down, he knew this was about more than the jump. It was about breaking through self-imposed limits, about showing that transformation required action, no matter the fear. On the morning of the fundraiser, the town gathered by the lake, wrapped in coats and scarves, faces bright despite the cold. Harold's family was there, Jamie and Mike cheering loudly, their smiles a steady anchor. Friends from the SkyStory project stood nearby, holding signs and chanting encouragement. Harold's heart pounded as he changed into the event gear, the chilly wind biting at his skin. He looked around at the other jumpers, some younger, some older, all determined. The local news crew was filming, cameras catching every moment. The mayor gave a brief speech about community, resilience, and the power of daring to dream. Then, it was time. One by one, participants leapt off the dock into the icy water, gasps and laughter echoing across the lake. Harold felt his turn approaching, his legs trembling not from cold but anticipation. He closed his eyes for a moment, recalling the journey that had brought him here, from the despair of isolation to the joy of purpose. He thought of Claire's belief in him, of Elon Musk's relentless courage, and of every person who had shared their story through SkyStory. "I am not too old," he whispered to himself. "I am alive." Then, with a deep breath, Harold pushed off the dock and plunged into the freezing water. The shock of cold was immediate and fierce, stealing his breath and igniting every nerve. But beneath the initial shock, a fierce joy surged through him, a wild, electric reminder that he was fully alive, fully present. He kicked and surfaced, gasping, laughter bubbling up despite the chill. Cheers erupted from the crowd, and Harold felt tears sting his eyes. Emerging from the water, he was met with hugs, applause, and pride. In that moment, age, fear, and doubt seemed to fall away like shedding old skin. Harold's leap had become a metaphor not only for his journey but for anyone who felt trapped by time or circumstance. Later, wrapped in a warm towel, Harold sat with Jamie and Mike by the fire at home, the adrenaline still buzzing. "I can't believe you did that," Jamie said, shaking her head with a smile. "I'm proud of you, Dad." Mike nodded. "You showed all of us what it means to be brave." Harold smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace and accomplishment. The jump wasn't just a one-time event, it was a declaration of ongoing transformation. In the days that followed, Harold noticed a shift in himself. The leap had awakened a new confidence, a renewed willingness to embrace uncertainty and push boundaries. He began exploring new ideas for SkyStory, incorporating virtual reality, partnering with senior centers nationwide, and developing training programs to empower elders as digital storytellers. Yet, the leap of faith also reminded him of the importance of balance. He took care to listen to his body, incorporating gentle yoga and mindful breathing into his routine. He prioritized rest, nutrition, and moments of quiet reflection. Aging, he realized, was not about fighting time but partnering with it, finding harmony between action and acceptance. One afternoon, Harold received a call from an old friend, George, whom he hadn't seen in years. George was a retired engineer who had once worked at a rocket lab and had always admired Harold's curiosity and drive. Their conversation quickly turned to innovation, aging, and the power of risk-taking. George confessed he'd always been hesitant to try new things in later life, fearing failure and embarrassment. Harold shared his recent leap, the courage it had required, and the liberation it brought. "It's never too late to take that leap," Harold said. "Sometimes, the hardest part is just deciding to jump." Inspired by Harold, George expressed interest in volunteering with SkyStory, eager to contribute his skills and wisdom. The idea of reconnecting with old friends and forging new partnerships filled Harold with joy. Around this time, Harold also began mentoring a small group of elders who wanted to launch their own creative projects. One woman, Clara, was working on a memoir about her life as a nurse during turbulent times. Another, Jim, was crafting a documentary about his years as a jazz musician. Harold encouraged them to use SkyStory's drone and storytelling technology to bring their visions to life, helping them overcome technical hurdles and self-doubt. Watching these projects unfold, Harold felt a deep sense of fulfillment. His leap had become a catalyst, sparking others to find their own wings. The community they built was vibrant, diverse, and alive with possibility. Yet, Harold remained grounded in humility and patience. He knew transformation was not linear. There were setbacks, technology glitches, funding shortfalls, moments of loneliness. But each challenge was met with resilience and collective support. One evening, as Harold sat on his porch watching the stars, he reflected on the journey so far. From the despair of feeling forgotten to the exhilaration of leaping into the unknown, he had learned that courage was not the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. He thought about Elon Musk's audacity, how Musk's vision of the future pushed boundaries and reshaped reality. Harold realized that while he was no billionaire entrepreneur, he too had the power to innovate and inspire in his own sphere. The leap of faith had been more than a splash in cold water, it was a profound act of reclaiming agency and purpose. As winter deepened, Harold set his sights on the future. He planned to launch a new SkyStory initiative focused on mental health, using storytelling to foster connection and healing among isolated seniors. He was also exploring ways to collaborate with healthcare providers to integrate the program into therapy and rehabilitation. The possibilities felt endless. But Harold also knew the importance of savoring the present, of cherishing the moments of laughter, love, and quiet grace. He often called Jamie and Mike, sharing stories and laughter, grateful for the family that had supported him through every step. One afternoon, Harold received a message from a young woman named Layla, a tech developer passionate about aging and social impact. She proposed creating a mobile app that could simplify SkyStory access for elders with limited tech experience. Harold was excited by the prospect of reaching even more people and welcomed her collaboration. The leap of faith had opened doors to new partnerships, ideas, and friendships. Reflecting on the journey, Harold realized that every transformation required an initial leap, sometimes small, sometimes bold, but always courageous. Whether it was learning to pilot a drone, sharing a story, or plunging into icy water, each act of faith built momentum toward a life lived fully and fearlessly. As he prepared for the next phase of his work, Harold held on to a phrase he had heard from Elon Musk during a talk. "Don't be afraid to fail. Be afraid not to try." This wisdom echoed in his heart, reminding him that aging was not a period of decline but a chapter rich with opportunity to dream, to dare, and to leap. With roots deep and wings ready, Harold knew he was prepared for whatever came next. The future awaited, and he was ready to jump. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?